Sarah Brennan couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the pure white yacht washed ashore on the rocky coast of Gulls Point on that freezing cold October morning. She thought it was a hallucination caused by the sleepless, hardship-filled life she had endured for the past 3 months. Sarah, with her 4 small children, walked helplessly toward it, not knowing what would happen to her because of this yacht on the Maine coast. As Sarah walked toward the yacht with her children against the rugged rocks, she smiled for the first time in 3 months, hoping and excited that this yacht would be their salvation. But this was something much more dangerous. That gleaming white yacht was not their salvation. The yacht she was walking toward with her children was actually evidence of a ruthless crime, one so heinous that the man who owned it would commit murder to keep it hidden and untouched. Sarah was walking toward the very center of an incredible conspiracy involving enormous crimes. Before diving into this story of despair, discovery, and a price so horrific you won't believe what you hear, I want you to understand one thing. This is not a story of Sarah's luck turning or a miraculous escape. This is the story of a widow with 4 small children who don't know when they last ate, with only $12 in tattered bills in her pocket. A story that will make her the most dangerous woman on the East Coast because of what she will endure. And by the end of this story, we will learn why the precious treasures that seem like such a big dream in our lives remain just that, a dream. Sarah Brennan was 34 years old when the influenza pandemic of 1957 took her husband Thomas and left her alone with 4 children in a fishing village that had already forgotten how to be kind to widows. The cottage they'd rented for 8 years overlooking the harbor had been Thomas's pride, a small but sturdy place where he'd planned to watch his children grow up safe from the storms that regularly battered the Maine coast. Now it was just another reminder of everything she'd lost, and the rent was 3 months overdue. Thomas had been a lobsterman like his father and grandfather before him, working the same waters that had fed their family for generations. But when the sickness took him, it took more than just a husband and father. It took their boat, their traps, their entire way of life. The Cassandra, their 30-foot lobster boat that represented everything they owned in the world, had been sold immediately after the funeral to pay for medical bills and burial costs. What little remained had been stretched thin, trying to keep 4 children fed through the harsh Maine winter. Now it was October, and the money was gone. When Sarah opened the rusty, dirty refrigerator in the small kitchen of the clubhouse, there was only a carton of condensed milk and a tiny amount of potatoes inside, not even enough for a small child. These ingredients had been transformed into a soup that wouldn't fill anyone's stomach but could at least provide some warmth against the October chill outside. Outside, the October cold and wind were blowing so hard they could practically crack the windows. All the children, from 6-year-old Emma to 15-year-old James, weren't asking when dinner would be ready, but they were eagerly waiting for the warm soup to pass through their stomachs after so many days. Their mother Sarah was preparing dinner with helpless, empty eyes. After the meal was ready, the 4 children finished their share of soup in about a minute. 6-year-old Emma was even licking her plate. However, because these children had been very well behaved by their family, even though it was a small meal, they thanked their mother for the food and hugged her after eating. Sarah, meanwhile, was filled with pride and happiness on one hand, but on the other, her eyes welled up with sadness at not being able to provide more for her children. After the meal, James, the eldest child, embodied the stubbornness and ambition that had been a defining trait of Brennan men for generations, a trait named after his grandfather. Since finishing school, the only thing he had thought about and strived for was finding work around the harbor. However, October was the hardest time for a small child to find work in a tiny fishing village. All the tourists who came in the summer had left. The lobster season was over, and the local people were busy with their own families. The few jobs available went to grown men with experience and connections, not to 15-year-old boys whose fathers were no longer alive to vouch for them. 12-year-old Michael had taken to disappearing for hours at a time, returning with whatever he could scavenge from the tide pools and abandoned fishing gear. 9-year-old Lily helped her mother with what little housework remained in a house that had been stripped of anything valuable weeks ago. And little Emma, barely old enough to understand why her father wasn't coming home, had developed the unnerving habit of saving half of whatever food she was given, hiding it under her pillow for Papa when he gets back. The notice from the landlord had been nailed to their door 3 days earlier. Final notice: eviction proceedings will commence October 15th unless full payment of $180 is received. Today was October 12th. Sarah had spent the previous evening walking the docks, swallowing her pride to ask for work from men who had once been Thomas's friends. She'd offered to clean fish, mend nets, scrub boat decks, anything that might earn a few dollars to buy time. But the looks she'd received weren't just dismissive, they were uncomfortable. A young widow with 4 children represented a responsibility no one wanted to acknowledge. If they helped her, where would it end? How many other disparate families would come knocking? The harbor master, a gruff man named Coleman who'd known Thomas since boyhood, had been the most direct. Sarah, you're a good woman, and Thomas was a good man, but you can't make a living here without a boat, and you can't get a boat without money. Maybe it's time to think about Portland or Boston, somewhere with opportunities for someone in your situation. Her situation, as if being widowed with 4 children was a character flaw rather than a tragedy. That's why she was out on the cliffs that gray morning, despite the wind and the cold. Not looking for work, there was no work to be found. Not hoping for charity, she'd exhausted those possibilities. She was simply walking, trying to think of a solution that didn't exist, trying to find hope in a landscape as empty and unforgiving as her bank account. The children were still asleep when she'd slipped out of the cottage. She'd left a note: gone for a walk, stay inside, back soon. It wasn't exactly exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that she was walking to the edge of Gull's Point, the rocky promontory that jutted out into the Atlantic like an accusing finger, to stare at the water that had taken her husband and decide whether she had the strength to keep fighting. Gull's Point was a dangerous place, avoided by locals except in the calmest weather. The cliffs dropped 60 feet to a narrow beach strewn with boulders the size of houses, where the tide rushed in and out with murderous force. Ships had been breaking apart on those rocks for 2 centuries, and the Coast Guard had given up trying to rescue foolish tourists who ventured too close to the edge. It was the perfect place to be alone with impossible thoughts. The fog was thick that morning, rolling in from the Atlantic in great gray walls that reduced visibility to a few yards. Sarah pulled her thin coat tighter against the wind and picked her way carefully along the cliff path. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was hypnotic, rhythmic, almost peaceful. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to stop thinking about rent and food and the future she couldn't provide for her children. That's when the fog shifted. Just for a moment, the gray curtain parted, and Sarah found herself looking down at something that made her question her own sanity. There, settled among the massive boulders as if it had been placed there by a crane, was a yacht. Not the working boats she was familiar with, not the practical lobster boats and fishing vessels that populated Rockport Harbor. This was something from another world, entirely as sleek, the gleaming white vessel that had to be 70 feet long, with chrome fittings that caught what little light filtered through the fog, and a flying bridge that spoke of luxury she'd only seen in magazines. Sarah rubbed her eyes and looked again. The yacht was still there, sitting upright and apparently undamaged among the rocks. The tide was out, revealing that the vessel was resting on a bed of sand and smaller stones rather than impaled on the jagged granite that had claimed so many ships. It looked almost purposeful, as if someone had deliberately beached it in the one spot along this treacherous coast where it might survive intact. Her first thought was practical. Someone would be looking for this boat. A vessel of that size and obvious value didn't just disappear without launching massive search and rescue operations. Her second thought was more complex. What if no one was looking for it? What if, somehow, this was the answer to prayers she'd been too proud to voice? Sarah knew the maritime law as well as anyone who'd grown up in a fishing community. Vessels found abandoned in international waters became the property of whoever salvaged them, but the legal definition of abandoned was complex and often disputed in court. A yacht of this caliber would have insurance, registration, a paper trail that connected it to people with the resources to fight for their property. But if it had been sitting here for days or weeks without anyone claiming it, the practical voice in her head, the voice that sounded like Thomas, warned her to walk away, to report the find to the Coast Guard and let the proper authorities handle whatever situation had led to this vessel being beached on her coastline. But the desperate voice, the one that had been growing stronger with each empty meal and each approaching deadline, whispered something different. For children, $12, 3 days until eviction. What did she have to lose? The climb down to the beach was treacherous, but Sarah had spent her childhood exploring these cliffs. She knew which handholds could be trusted, which ledges would support her weight. The fog provided cover, muffling the sound of loose stones and hiding her descent from anyone who might be watching from the village. By the time she reached the narrow strip of sand and rock that served as a beach, her hands were scraped and her knees were shaking, but she was alive and undetected. Up close, the yacht was even more impressive and more mysterious. The hull showed no signs of impact damage, no scrapes or gouges that would indicate it had been driven onto the rocks by storm or accident. The name painted in elegant script across the stern read Meridian, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Boston, MA. But what struck Sarah as odd was the complete absence of any distress signals, any sign that the crew had attempted to attract rescue. More troubling was the silence. A vessel this size should have generators running, bilge pumps operating, some kind of mechanical heartbeat that kept it alive even when anchored or beached. But the Meridian sat in absolute stillness, as if it had been abandoned not just recently, but completely. No sound came from within the hull. No movement stirred the rigging. Even the seabirds that normally flocked to anything unusual on their territory seemed to be avoiding the yacht, wheeling overhead but never landing. Sarah walked slowly around the perimeter of the vessel, her boots crunching on the mixture of sand and broken shells that covered the beach. The yacht was equipped with everything she'd expect to see on a luxury vessel: radar arrays, satellite communication equipment, a tender that hung from davits off the stern. But the tender was still in place, which meant whoever had been aboard hadn't used it to reach shore, and the gangway was extended, forming a bridge from the yacht to a flat boulder that someone could easily use to board or disembark. It was an invitation, or a trap. Sarah stood at the bottom of the gangway, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. Every instinct developed over 34 years of cautious living told her to retreat, to climb back up the cliffs and pretend she'd never seen this vessel. But those instincts had been developed when she had a husband to provide for their family, when she had the luxury of being careful. Now, with her children facing homelessness and starvation, caution was a luxury she couldn't afford. She placed her foot on the gangway, testing its stability. The aluminum surface was solid, well maintained, with no signs of corrosion or damage. Whoever owned this yacht had taken good care of it, which made its presence on this remote beach even more mysterious. Sarah climbed slowly, her hand trailing along the safety rail, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of crew or passengers. The deck was immaculate, not just clean, but perfect, as if someone had spent hours preparing it for inspection. The brass fittings gleamed, the tick decking showed no scuffs or stains, and even the rope work was executed with military precision. This wasn't the casual maintenance of weekend sailors. This was the kind of care that suggested either professional crew or owners with unlimited resources and obsessive attention to detail. Sarah made her way toward the main cabin, her footsteps silent on the non-slip decking. The fog swirled around her, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the yacht feel like a ghost ship materializing from another dimension. Through the large windows of the main cabin, she could see hints of luxury that took her breath away. Leather upholstery, polished wood, brass fixtures that probably cost more than her family's entire annual income when Thomas was alive. The cabin door was unlocked. This should have been her final warning, the detail that sent her scrambling back up the cliffs to safety. No one left a yacht of this value unlocked and unattended, especially not in waters known for their treacherous conditions and proximity to fishing communities, where desperate people might be tempted by opportunity. But Sarah's desperation had evolved beyond normal reasoning. She was no longer thinking like a cautious widow. She was thinking like a mother whose children were facing starvation. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The interior of the Meridian was a showcase of wealth and taste that seemed to mock her own poverty. The main salon featured a dining table that could seat 8, surrounded by chairs, upholstered in leather so soft it probably cost more per yard than Sarah spent on food in a month. Original artwork hung on the bulkheads, and she recognized at least one piece that she'd seen reproduced in magazines. Small painting that she was reasonably certain was worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But it was the signs of interrupted life that made her blood run cold. Crystal glasses sat abandoned on the dining table, some still containing the dregs of what looked like expensive champagne. Plates held the remains of what had clearly been an elegant meal. Lobster shells, remnants of some kind of elaborate dessert, fine china stained with sauces that had long since congealed. Napkins were scattered across the table as if the diners had risen suddenly, abandoning their meal in the middle of the course. Sarah moved deeper into the cabin, her senses alert for any sound or sign of human presence. In the galley, she found evidence of preparation for that interrupted meal, expensive ingredients left out on marble countertops, a bottle of wine that probably costs more than her monthly rent standing open and forgotten. The refrigerator hummed quietly, still maintaining its temperature, which meant the yacht's power systems were functioning normally. This wasn't abandonment due to mechanical failure. This was something else. She made her way to the master stateroom, pushing open the door with trembling fingers. The bed was unmade, expensive linens tangled as if someone had risen in a hurry. A woman's evening gown lay crumpled on the floor, and jewelry was scattered across the vanity. Real jewelry, Sarah realized with a start. Diamonds that caught and reflected the dim light filtering through the portholes, pearls that glowed with a luster that only came from the real thing. But it was the safe that stopped her heart. Built into the bulkhead behind the bed was a substantial steel safe, the kind used by people who had serious valuables to protect. The door hung open, revealing an interior that had clearly been emptied in haste. Documents were scattered on the floor, what looked like insurance papers, registration documents, and other official paperwork. But there, overlooked in the apparent panic of evacuation, was something that made Sarah's hands shake as she picked it up. Cash, a substantial roll of $100 bills, secured with a rubber band and apparently forgotten in whoever had cleaned out the safe. Sarah counted quickly, her fingers trembling. $2,300. More money than she'd seen at one time in her entire life. And tucked behind the cash, as if someone had tried to hide it even within the safe, was something that explained everything and changed everything. A leather portfolio containing what appeared to be business documents, contracts, and correspondence. Sarah's reading skills weren't sophisticated, but she could make out enough to understand that she was looking at evidence of something illegal. References to cargo that shouldn't exist, payments for services that couldn't be legal, and most chilling of all, a letter dated just 1 week earlier that mentioned completing the transaction and ensuring no witnesses remain. Sarah sat down heavily on the edge of the expensive bed, the portfolio trembling in her hands. The yacht wasn't abandoned due to accident or mechanical failure. The crew and passengers hadn't been rescued by passing ships or Coast Guard vessels. They had fled, leaving behind evidence of whatever criminal enterprise had brought them to these waters. And now she was the witness they'd been so concerned about eliminating. The sound of engines in the distance made her blood freeze. Through the porthole, she could see lights moving through the fog, the running lights of multiple vessels approaching from the direction of the harbor. They moved with purpose, not the random pattern of fishing boats heading out for the day's work. These boats were coming here, to this beach, to this yacht. Sarah stuffed the cash and documents into the pockets of her coat, her survival instincts finally overriding her curiosity. She had perhaps minutes before those boats reached the beach, and if the Meridian's owners were returning, they wouldn't be happy to find evidence that someone had been exploring their abandoned vessel. The letter's reference to no witnesses took on a sinister new meaning as the engine sounds grew louder. She made her way back through the cabin, grabbing what supplies she could carry, canned goods from the galley, a bottle of water, anything that might help feed her children. But even as she gathered these practical necessities, her mind was racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. $2,300 was enough to pay their rent, buy food for months, maybe even make a start somewhere else. But it was also evidence of her trespass. pass, proof that she'd been aboard a vessel where she had no legal right to be. The portfolio was even more dangerous. If its contents were what they appeared to be, she was carrying proof of criminal activity that powerful people would kill to suppress. The smart thing would be to drop it over the side, let the tide carry it away and pretend she'd never seen it. But Sarah had learned something about herself in the months since Thomas's death. Desperation made its own rules, and sometimes the most dangerous course was also the only path to survival. She climbed down the gangway and began the treacherous ascent back up the cliffs, the stolen money heavy in her pocket and the sound of approaching engines driving her upward faster than safety should allow. Behind her, the fog began to lift, revealing the true scope of what was heading for Gull's Point. Not just one or two vessels, but a small fleet of boats moving with the coordination of a military operation. As she reached the top of the cliffs and began her race back to the cottage where her children waited, Sarah Brennan realized that finding the Meridian hadn't solved her problems. It had transformed them into something far more dangerous. She was no longer just a widow struggling to survive. She was a woman carrying secrets that men would kill for, and she had no idea who she could trust with the knowledge that could save her family or destroy them all. The $2,300 felt like salvation and damnation wrapped in the same blood-stained package, and somewhere behind her, hidden in the fog and the sound of engines, the real owners of those secrets were coming to reclaim what was theirs. The game had changed, and Sarah Brennan was about to discover whether she had the strength and cunning to play by rules she'd never imagined. Sarah burst through the cottage door with the desperation of a woman fleeing from hell itself, her coat pockets heavy with stolen money and evidence of crime she barely understood. Her 4 children looked up from their makeshift breakfast of water and stale bread, crumbs with the hollow-eyed hope that had become their permanent expression since their father's death. But for the first time in months, Sarah's face carried something other than defeat. "Pack everything," she commanded, her voice sharp with urgency as she pulled the roll of $100 bills from her pocket and set it on the kitchen table like a talisman against disaster. "We're leaving right now." James, her 15-year-old, stared at the money with the suspicion of someone who'd learned that windfalls usually came with prices too terrible to pay. "Ma, where did you get that?" "That's more money than PA ever brought home from a month of lobstering." "I found it," Sarah said, which was technically true, "but we can't keep it unless we're smart about it. There are men coming who might want it back, and we need to be gone before they figure out where to look." She moved through the cottage with frantic efficiency, grabbing their few possessions and stuffing them into the battered suitcases that had belonged to her mother. The children watched in stunned silence as their mother transformed from defeated widow to fierce protector in the span of minutes. Michael and Lily began helping without being asked, rolling clothes and gathering their meager toys. Little Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit and asked the question that pierced Sarah's heart. "Are we going to see Papa where we're going?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling to look her youngest in the eye, "but we're going somewhere safe, somewhere warm, where we'll always have enough to eat." What she didn't tell them was that she had no idea where that place might be, or how they would get there with half the Coast Guard potentially looking for them. The portfolio hidden in her coat contained evidence that could destroy powerful people, but it also made her family a target. The smart thing would be to burn the documents and claim ignorance of whatever had happened aboard the Meridian. But intelligence and desperation often pointed in opposite directions, and Sarah had learned that desperate mothers didn't have the luxury of making smart choices. The sound of vehicles approaching on the coastal road made her blood freeze. Through the cottage's front window, she could see 3 black cars moving slowly along the harbor front, their occupants clearly searching for something or someone. These weren't local police or Coast Guard officials. They moved with the coordination and purpose of federal agents, or worse, private security, working for people who operated outside the normal boundaries of law enforcement. "Backdoor," Sarah whispered to her children, abandoning the suitcases and grabbing only what they could carry in their pockets. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow me exactly." The cottage sat on a small rise overlooking the harbor, with a narrow path that led down through scrub pine and beach grass to an abandoned lobster shack where Thomas used to store gear during the off-season. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it offered concealment until she could figure out their next move. Sarah led her children down the path, praying that whoever was in those cars hadn't thought to position watchers around the perimeter of the property. From the lobster shack, hidden behind stacks of rotting traps and nets, they watched as men in dark suits methodically searched their cottage. These weren't government agents. Government agents would have announced themselves, shown warrants, followed procedure. These men moved like predators, efficient and utterly without regard for legal niceties. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. "Ma," James whispered, his voice tight with controlled fear. "What did you really find out there?" Sarah looked at her eldest son, this boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, and made a decision that would change their lives forever. She pulled the leather portfolio from her coat and showed him the documents. Inside contracts for cargo that shouldn't exist, payment schedules for services that couldn't be legal, correspondence that referenced elimination of witnesses. "I found proof that very bad people are doing very bad things," she said quietly, "and now they know someone found their secret." James read over the documents with the careful attention of a young man who'd been handling adult responsibilities since his father's death. His face paled as he began to understand the implications. "Ma, this is evidence of murder and drug smuggling. Maybe worse. I know, we have to take this to the police." Sarah gestured toward the men searching their cottage with professional thoroughness. "Those men probably own half the police in 3 counties, and the other half wouldn't believe a poor widow over whoever's paying their salaries." "Then what do we do?" It was Michael, her 12-year-old 12-year-old, who provided the answer that saved their lives. We sell it. Sarah and James stared at him, and he continued with the logic that only comes from children who've learned to think like survivors. Ma found money, right, and papers that bad men want back. So we sell the papers to people who want to hurt the bad men, like insurance, but backwards. From the mouth of a 12-year-old it sounded almost innocent, but Sarah recognized the brutal logic of blackmail when she heard it. And the terrible thing was that it might be their only option. The portfolio contained evidence of federal crimes, but more importantly it contained names, dates, and financial records that could destroy political careers and criminal enterprises. In the right hands it was worth far more than $2,300. The question was finding the right hands before the wrong hands found them. The men finished searching the cottage and regrouped near their cars, clearly frustrated by their failure to find whatever they'd been looking for. Sarah watched through a gap in the lobster shack's walls as they spread out, beginning a systematic search of the surrounding area. It would be perhaps 20 minutes before they reached the abandoned shack, and when they did, there would be no escape. We need to get to the harbor, Sarah decided. Find someone with a boat who can get us to Portland or Boston, someone who won't ask questions. But even as she said it, she knew the harbor was watched. The men in the black cars would have positioned people at every obvious escape route. They needed something else, someone who operated outside the normal channels and had reasons of their own to avoid official attention. That's when Sarah thought of Danny McGrath. Danny was what polite society called a smuggler, and what the fishing community called a businessman who understood that some cargo didn't benefit from government oversight. He ran lobsters to Boston restaurants that didn't ask too many questions about licensing, transported medicine to Canadian ports, and occasionally provided transportation for people who needed to travel without creating paper trails. Thomas had always avoided Danny, considering him bad luck and worse company, but Sarah had different priorities now. Danny kept his boat at the old pier, the one the Coast Guard had abandoned when the new harbor was built. It was isolated, concealed by the ruins of a fish processing plant that had closed during the Depression. If they could reach it without being seen, Sarah might be able to negotiate passage for her family, assuming she could convince Danny that the risk was worth whatever payment she could offer. The problem was getting there. The old pier was a half-mile walk along an exposed coastal road, with no cover and no alternative route that wouldn't take hours they didn't have. Sarah looked at her 4 children, trying to calculate whether they could make the journey without being spotted by the search teams that were closing in around them. Ma, Lily said quietly, pointing toward the harbor. Look, a Coast Guard cutter was approaching from the northeast, its searchlight cutting through the fog that still clung to the water. But this wasn't a rescue vessel responding to reports of a missing yacht. The cutter was moving in coordination with the cars on shore, part of the same search operation. Sarah's blood chilled as she realized the scope of what they were facing. Whoever wanted that portfolio back had resources that reached far beyond local law enforcement. Federal agents, James said, his voice hollow. They've got federal agents looking for us. No, Sarah said, studying the coordination between the various search teams. Federal agents would have announced themselves, shown credentials, followed procedures. These people are pretending to be federal agents, which means they're either criminals with government connections or they're government agents acting like criminals. The distinction might have been academic, but it gave Sarah a slim thread of hope. Real federal agents would have legal obligations, oversight, procedures they'd have to follow. Fake federal agents had more operational freedom, but they also had to worry about real federal agents discovering their activities. Either way, the men hunting her family were working under constraints that might be exploitable. The sound of boots on gravel announced that the search was getting closer. Through the gaps in the lobster shack's walls, Sarah could see men in dark suits moving methodically through the scrub vegetation, checking every possible hiding place. They would reach the shack within minutes, and once they did, there would be no escape. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her 6 months earlier, when she was still the kind of woman who believed in following rules and trusting authorities. She pulled out one of the documents from the portfolio, a letter that detailed payment schedules for what appeared to be contract killings, and tore off a corner that contained a name and phone number. James, she whispered, pressing the scrap of paper into his hand. If something happens to me, call this number. Tell whoever answers that you have information about the Meridian operation and you want to make a deal. Ma, what are you talking about? Insurance, she said, using Michael's word. These papers are only valuable if the right people know we have them, and the only way to stay alive is to make sure that killing us costs more than keeping us alive. She kissed each of her children, quick and fierce, and then did something that went against every maternal instinct she possessed. She left them hidden in the lobster shack and walked out into the open, her hands raised where the searching men could see them. I'm here, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the scrub grass. I'm the one you're looking for. The response was immediate and terrifying in its efficiency. 3 men converged on her position within seconds, their movements coordinated and professional. These were not local thugs or hastily assembled muscle. They were experienced operatives who'd done this kind of work before. The lead man, a thin individual with pale eyes and expensive shoes that were completely inappropriate for coastal terrain, approached her with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Mrs. Brent, he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent ice through her veins. We understand you've had an eventful morning. I was walking, Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I saw a boat on the beach. Thought someone might need help. Of course you did. His smile was reptilian, utterly without warmth. And being a good citizen, you naturally went aboard to check for survivors. Sarah said nothing, understanding that every word she spoke could be used against her children if this conversation went bad. The man studied her for a long moment, clearly evaluating how much she knew and how much trouble she represented. "The boat you found contains property belonging to very important people," he continued. "People who value their privacy and don't appreciate unwanted attention. I'm sure you understand. I understand that I'm a widow with 4 children who doesn't want any trouble." "Excellent. Then you'll understand why it would be best for everyone if you forgot what you saw this morning. Forgot completely. In exchange, we're prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope thick with what appeared to be cash. Sarah stared at it, understanding that this was both a bribe and a test. If she took the money and walked away, she'd be admitting that she'd found something worth paying her to forget. If she refused the money, she'd be confirming that she knew more than she was admitting. "How much?" she asked. $5,000. "More than enough to solve your immediate financial difficulties." It was more money than Sarah had ever seen offered for anything, but it was also confirmation that what she'd taken from the yacht was worth far more than $5,000. The portfolio in her coat contained information that these people valued at much higher stakes, and her knowledge of its contents made her either an asset or a liability they needed to eliminate. "I'll take it," she said, reaching for the envelope. The pale-eyed man pulled it back slightly, just out of her reach. "Of course, we'll need to make sure you haven't retained any souvenirs from your visit to the boat. A quick search, purely as a formality." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to nod agreement. If they searched her and found the documents, she was dead. If they searched her and found only the money, they might let her live, but they'd know she'd taken something else. Either way, the search was a death sentence unless she could find a way to turn the tables. "Before you do that," she said, pulling the scrap of paper with the name and phone number from her pocket, "you might want to know that I've already made contact with some people who are very interested in information about the Meridian operation." The man's pale eyes fixed on the paper, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not surprise, not anger, but genuine fear of whoever that name and number belonged to. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice now sharp with tension. "From the same place I got this," Sarah said, partially withdrawing the portfolio from her coat before pushing it back out of sight. "And there's a lot more where that came from." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Sarah realized she'd just shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. They were no longer dealing with a desperate widow who'd stumbled onto something she didn't understand. They were dealing with someone who might have allies, someone who'd already taken steps to protect herself. "Mrs. Brennan," the pale-eyed man said carefully, "I think perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think we should continue it right here," Sarah replied, "where my children can see us talking like civilized people." Tea was a bluff built on desperation and half-understood intelligence, but it worked. The men were clearly reassessing the situation, trying to determine how much Sarah actually knew and how much damage she could do if they simply eliminated her. The name on that scrap of paper apparently carried enough weight to make them hesitate, and hesitation was the only advantage Sarah had. "What do you want?" the man asked finally. "I want my family to be safe," Sarah said, "and I want enough money to make sure we can disappear somewhere your employers will never find us." "How much?" Sarah thought about the documents hidden in her coat, about the evidence of murder and corruption that could destroy careers in criminal enterprises. She thought about her children hidden in the lobster shack, and about the fact that she might not survive the next 10 minutes regardless of what she said. $50,000, she said, "and passage to wherever we want to go." The pale-eyed man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mrs. Brennan, you're talking about a great deal of money. I'm talking about information that could put your employers in federal prison for the rest of their lives," Sarah replied. $50,000 is a bargain. What happened next would depend on whether these men believed she had the evidence she claimed to possess, and whether they thought that evidence was more dangerous in her hands than the alternative. Sarah had just committed herself to a game of blackmail against people who killed witnesses as a matter of routine business practice. But as she stood there on the Maine coast with her children's lives hanging in the balance, Sarah Brennan discovered that motherhood had transformed her into someone capable of playing that game to win. The negotiation that followed on that windswept piece of Maine coastline would have seemed surreal too. Sarah Brennan, 6 months earlier, when her biggest worry had been whether Thomas would bring home enough lobsters to pay for Emma's new winter coat. Now she stood facing 3 armed men who represented interests powerful enough to corrupt federal agencies, bargaining for her family's survival with evidence she barely understood, and courage she hadn't known she possessed. The pale-eyed man who had introduced himself only as Mr. Collins studied the scrap of paper Sarah had shown him with the intensity of someone reading his own death warrant. The name and phone number clearly meant something significant to him, though Sarah had only the vaguest idea of what that might be. She'd torn it from a letter that mentioned alternative arrangements and contingency protocols, language that suggested the existence of competing criminal factions or rival intelligence operations. "Mrs. Brennan," Collins said finally, his voice carefully modulated to project calm authority while his eyes betrayed growing anxiety. "You're playing a very dangerous game with people who don't forgive mistakes." "I'm not playing anything," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. "I'm a mother trying to protect her children from people who kill witnesses as a matter of routine business practice. The only game being played here is the one where you decide whether I'm more valuable alive or dead." Collins exchanged another look with his companions, and Sarah caught the subtle hand signals that passed between them. These men were military or intelligence trained, accustomed to operating in hostile territory where communication had to be both precise and concealed. The fact that they were using such protocols suggested they considered her genuinely dangerous rather than simply inconvenient. $50,000 is a substantial substantial sum, Collins said. It would require authorization from people who don't appreciate being disturbed for trivial matters. Then I guess you'd better convince them this isn't trivial. The bluff was everything now. Sarah had no real understanding of the power structures she was confronting, no knowledge of the competing interests that might make her information valuable to multiple parties. All she had was the desperate intuition of a mother who'd realized that showing weakness would get her children killed. Collins walked a short distance away and made a phone call on what appeared to be a satellite phone. Speaking in tones too low for Sarah to overhear, she used the time to scan the terrain around them, looking for escape routes and trying to spot where her children were hidden. The lobster shack was invisible from this angle, concealed by the rise and fall of the coastal landscape, but she could see men with binoculars positioned at strategic points around the area. If this negotiation went badly, there would be no running. When Collins returned, his expression had changed subtly. The confidence was still there, but it was now underlaid with something that looked like respect, or perhaps recognition that he was dealing with someone more dangerous than he'd initially assumed. My employers are willing to discuss terms, he said, but they'll need proof that you actually possess what you claim to have before any money changes hands. Smart employers, Sarah said. I'd want proof too. She reached into her coat and withdrew a single page from the portfolio, not one of the most damaging documents, but one that contained enough specific names, dates, and financial details to demonstrate the scope of what she'd taken from the yacht. Collins examined it carefully, his face growing paler as he read. Where's the rest of it? He asked. Somewhere safe. Somewhere your people will never find it unless I personally retrieve it. And if anything happens to me or my family, it goes to people who would love to see your employers destroyed. It was another bluff, built on her fragile understanding of the document she'd just shown him. The letter had mentioned congressional investigations, federal prosecutions, and alternative distribution channels. That suggested the existence of law enforcement officials or journalists who were actively investigating whatever criminal enterprise the Meridian had been supporting. Mrs. Brennan, Collins said, you're asking us to trust that a desperate widow won't simply take our money and disappear. I'm asking you to trust that a desperate mother won't get her children killed by being stupid about this. You give me $50,000 and safe passage out of Maine, and you never hear from me again. You try to eliminate me, and every newspaper and federal agency on the East Coast gets copies of everything I found on that yacht. Collins studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to read whether she was bluffing or whether she'd actually taken the precautions she claimed. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, drawing on every lesson Thomas had taught her about dealing with difficult customers and hostile harbor officials. Never show weakness, never admit uncertainty, and never let them see that you're making it up as you go along. There's another problem, Collins said finally. Even if my employers agree to your terms, there are other parties involved in this situation, other people who have their own interests in what you found, the people whose name is on that paper. Among others, Mrs. Brennan. The Meridian wasn't just carrying cargo for one organization, it was serving as a nexus for multiple operations, some of which are in direct competition with each other. The documents you possess could damage several different groups, which means several different groups have reasons to want you silenced. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand the true complexity of what she'd stumbled into. The yacht hadn't just been evidence of a single criminal enterprise. It had been a meeting point for what appeared to be a consortium of illegal operations. The portfolio she'd taken contained information that could destroy multiple organizations, which meant she now had multiple sets of enemies, but it also meant she might have multiple sets of potential allies. Then I guess you'd better move fast, she said, before your competitors decide they'd rather eliminate me themselves than let you negotiate a settlement. As if summoned by her words, the sound of additional vehicles approaching made everyone freeze. Through the scrub, pine, and beach grass, Sarah could see a convoy of dark SUVs moving along the coastal road, not the careful, professional approach of Collins and his team, but the aggressive advance of people who weren't worried about subtlety or legal niceties. Federals, one of Collins's men said quietly, using the Spanish term that had become shorthand for federal agents among certain criminal organizations. No, Collins replied, his voice tight with concern. Those aren't federal vehicles. That's Torino's crew. Sarah didn't know who Torino was, but the fear in Collins's voice told her everything she needed to know. These were the competitors he'd mentioned, the other parties with interests in what she'd found aboard the Meridian, and unlike Collins and his men, who'd at least pretended to be reasonable, this new group was approaching with the obvious intention of using force. Mrs. Brennan, Collins said urgently, I strongly recommend you accept our offer immediately. Torino's people don't negotiate. What's their stake in this? They were using the Meridian as a transshipment point for narcotics coming up from South America. If the federal authorities get hold of the yacht's records, it could unravel their entire East Coast distribution network. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this new information. The documents in her coat weren't just evidence of corruption and murder. They were the operational records of a drug smuggling operation that probably moved millions of dollars worth of contraband through New England ports. No wonder multiple criminal organizations were willing to kill to suppress that information, but it also meant the information was valuable to federal authorities who were trying to break up those same criminal networks. How much time do we have? She asked. Maybe 5 minutes before Torino's people reach this position. Mrs. Brennan, these are not people you can negotiate with. They'll torture you to find out where you've hidden the documents, and then they'll kill you and your children to ensure your silence. The convoy was close enough now that Sarah could hear the roar of high-performance engines and the screech of tires on the coastal roads, sharp curves through the vegetation. She caught glimpses of men with automatic weapons preparing for what appeared to be a military-style assault on the area. 50,000, she said quickly. Cash, right now, and a boat to get my family out of here. Done, but Mrs. Brennan, even with our protection, there's no guarantee. Where are my children? The new voice cut through their conversation like a blade, and Sarah turned to see a man emerging from the scrubgrass with military precision. He was older than Collins, maybe 50, with the kind of scars that spoke of combat experience, and the kind of calm that suggested he'd killed people with his bare hands. This had to be Mrs. Brennan, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't identify. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I believe you're mistaken, Sarah replied, though her voice shook slightly as she spoke. Torino radiated menace in a way that Collins never had. Where Collins was dangerous because he was intelligent and well-connected, Torino was dangerous because he was utterly without conscience or restraint. The Meridian was carrying operational records for my organization, Torino continued, moving closer with the fluid motion of a predator stalking prey. Records that detail shipping schedules, personnel assignments, and financial arrangements that took years to establish. I need those records back, and I need my children to be safe, Sarah said. It seems we both have problems. Torino smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Mrs. Brennan, I don't think you understand your situation. Mr. Collins here represents people who still pretend to operate within certain legal boundaries. I don't share those constraints. I will do whatever is necessary to retrieve my property, regardless of the consequences to you or your family. Then you'll never see those records again, Sarah said, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. Because the first thing that happens if you hurt me or my children is that everything gets delivered to every federal agency and newspaper on the East Coast. An interesting bluff, Torino said, but I don't think you've had time to establish the kind of dead man switches you're describing. You've been too busy running and hiding to make sophisticated arrangements. He was right, and they both knew it. Sarah's threats were built on desperation and minimal understanding of the criminal world she'd stumbled into, but she also sensed that Torino's confidence was based on assumptions that might not be accurate. Maybe, she said, but are you willing to bet your entire operation on maybe? The standoff stretched out over several seconds, with Collins and his men positioned uneasily between Sarah and Torino's approaching forces. Sarah realized that she'd become the focal point of what might escalate into open warfare between competing criminal organizations, with her children caught in the crossfire. That's when the Coast Guard helicopter appeared. The sound of rotor blades cut through the tension like divine intervention, and Sarah looked up to see an official rescue helicopter approaching from the direction of the harbor. But this wasn't part of either criminal organization's operation. The helicopter was responding to reports of the abandoned yacht, following standard protocols for maritime emergencies, Federals Torino said, and for the first time since his arrival, he showed signs of concern. Legitimate Federals. Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. That's my insurance policy, she called out, loud enough for both Collins and Torino to hear. I called the Coast Guard before I came out here, told them I'd found evidence of criminal activity and needed federal protection. It was a lie built on coincidence, but it was exactly the kind of lie that might save her family's lives. Both criminal organizations would have to assume that she was now under federal protection, which meant killing her would bring down the kind of official investigation they'd been trying to avoid. The helicopter was close enough now that she could see Coast Guard markings and official insignia. Collins and Torino exchanged the kind of look that passed between professional enemies who suddenly found themselves facing a common threat. Mrs. Brennan, Collins said urgently, if you've actually involved federal authorities, you've made this situation much more complicated for everyone. Good, Sarah replied. Complicated keeps my children alive. Torino was already retreating toward his vehicles, unwilling to risk a confrontation with legitimate federal agents. His men moved with the same professional efficiency they'd shown during their approach, disappearing into the coastal scrub as if they'd never been there. Collins lingered for a moment longer. This isn't over, he said. Federal protection is temporary. Eventually, you'll be on your own again. Then I guess I'd better make the most of the time I have. The Coast Guard helicopter was circling now, its crew clearly trying to determine what was happening on the ground. Sarah waved her arms, signaling for assistance, and was rewarded by the sight of the aircraft beginning its descent toward the nearest suitable landing zone. As Collins and his remaining men melted away into the landscape, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She'd survived the immediate confrontation, but she'd also confirmed to multiple criminal organizations that she possessed information they were willing to kill for. The Coast Guard might provide temporary protection, but eventually she'd have to find a permanent solution to the problem of being the only witness to crimes that powerful people needed to keep secret. She thought about her children, still hidden in the lobster shack, and about the portfolio of documents that had become both their salvation and their curse. The $2,300 in cash might be enough to buy time, but the real question was whether she could find a way to turn her dangerous knowledge into lasting security for her family. The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of sand and salt spray, and Sarah began running toward it, knowing that her next conversation would determine whether her family survived to see another sunrise. As she ran, Sarah Brennan realized that finding the Meridian had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer the frightened widow who'd climbed down those cliffs that morning. She'd become someone capable of playing the most dangerous game in the world, with stakes that couldn't be higher and rules that changed by the minute. The only question now was whether she was smart enough to win. The Coast Guard helicopter that descended onto the windswept Maine coastline that October morning carried more than just federal authority. It carried the promise of sanctuary for for a widow who'd just discovered that survival sometimes required becoming someone you'd never imagined you could be. As the rotor wash whipped sand and salt spray around her, Sarah Brennan ran toward the aircraft with her heart pounding and her mind racing through the lies she'd need to tell to keep her family alive. The pilot who emerged from the helicopter was a woman in her 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years flying rescue missions along one of the most treacherous coastlines in North America. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes had seen everything from tourist boats broken apart on hidden rocks to drug runners trying to outrun federal agents in stolen speedboats. But something about the lone woman running toward her aircraft set off every instinct developed through 15 years of maritime law enforcement. "Ma'am," Hayes called out over the noise of the still-turning rotors, "are you the person who reported finding evidence of criminal activity?" Sarah's blood froze. She hadn't called the Coast Guard, had never reported anything to anyone. The helicopter's appearance had been a coincidence that she'd turned into a lifeline through desperate improvisation. But now she was face to face with a federal officer who expected specific information about a report that didn't exist. "Yes," Sarah said, committing herself to a deception that could either save her family or destroy them. "I found something on the beach. Something that I think you need to see." Hayes studied Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot deception under stress. She saw a woman who was clearly terrified but trying to project confidence. Someone whose clothes and appearance suggested financial hardship but whose posture indicated hidden strength. Most importantly, she saw someone who was telling the truth about having found something significant, even if she might be lying about the circumstances. "What exactly did you find, Mrs. Brennan?" "Sarah Brennan. I found a yacht, a big one, beached down in the rocks at Gulls Point, and there are things aboard that yacht that suggest something very illegal was happening." Hayes' expression sharpened. The Coast Guard had been tracking reports of unusual maritime activity along the Maine coast for months, vessels that appeared on radar briefly before disappearing, cargo transfers that happened in international waters under cover of darkness, and increasing evidence that New England's isolated coves were being used as staging areas for smuggling operations. "How long has this vessel been there, Mrs. Brennan?" "I don't know. I just found it this morning when I was walking the cliffs." "And you went aboard?" Sarah hesitated. Admitting to boarding an abandoned vessel could expose her to charges of trespassing or theft, but denying it would make her information worthless. "Yes, I thought someone might need help, but when I got inside, it was clear that whoever had been aboard had left in a hurry." "What did you see that made you think criminal activity was involved?" This was the crucial moment. Sarah had to provide enough specific information to convince Hayes that her report was legitimate, without revealing that she'd taken documents and cash from the vessel. She also had to do it in a way that would provide her family with federal protection without making them targets for prosecution. "There were papers scattered around," Sarah said carefully. "Business documents that mentioned cargo shipments and payment schedules. And some of the cargo descriptions didn't make sense for a pleasure vessel. Industrial chemicals, unmarked containers, references to special handling procedures for deliveries to specific coordinates rather than established ports. It was a careful mixture of truth and inference based on her limited understanding of what she'd seen in the portfolio. But it was enough to make Hayes' eyes widen with recognition. "Mrs. Brennan, you may have stumbled onto something very significant. We've been investigating reports of a smuggling network that's been using luxury vessels to transport contraband along the eastern seaboard. A yacht matching the description you've provided has been on our watch list for months." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with new terror. The Coast Guard's interest in the Meridian meant her report would be taken seriously, but it also meant she was now involved in a federal investigation that could expose her theft of the documents. She needed to walk a careful line between providing useful information and avoiding incrimination. "There's something else," Sarah said. "While I was looking around the yacht, I saw men in boats approaching from the harbor. I think they were coming to retrieve whatever was aboard. I hid until they left, but they seemed very interested in making sure no one had been aboard the vessel." Hayes immediately reached for the radio clipped to her flight suit. "Control, this is Rescue 7. I need immediate backup at grid reference 4-7 Alpha. Possible smuggling vessel recovery operation in progress. Request additional units in D liaison." The response came back within seconds. "Rescue 7. Be advised that federal assets are already en route to your location. Maintain position and await further instructions." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the implications. If federal assets were already responding to the situation, it meant someone else had reported the yacht's presence. Either Collins or Torino had contacts within federal law enforcement, or the situation was more complex than she'd understood. "Mrs. Brennan," Hayes said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw, and when you saw it. This may be part of a larger investigation, and your observations could be crucial evidence." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of additional helicopters approaching made them both look up. 2 more aircraft were visible against the gray October sky, not Coast Guard helicopters, but the unmarked black aircraft favored by federal agencies that preferred to operate without advertising their presence. D.I. Hayes said grimly, "This just became a federal operation." Sarah watched the approaching helicopters with growing dread. She'd thought that involving the Coast Guard would provide protection for her family, but instead she'd apparently stepped into the middle of an existing federal investigation. The documents in her coat weren't just evidence of criminal activity. They were federal evidence in an active case, and taking them constituted theft of government property. The first of the black helicopters touched down 50 yards away, a team of agents in tactical gear who moved with the precision of a military unit. Their leader, a compact man with the kind of eyes that missed nothing, approached Hayes and Sarah with the confidence of someone accustomed accustomed to taking control of complicated situations. Agent Mitchell DE, he said, flashing credentials. Lieutenant Commander, I'll need to debrief your witness immediately. Actually, Hayes replied, Mrs. Brennan here is the one who reported finding the vessel. She may have information about recovery operations that were already underway. Mitchell's attention focused on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. She could see him cataloging every detail about her appearance, her demeanor, her obvious nervousness. This was a man trained to spot deception and inconsistency, and Sarah realized that her improvised story was about to face professional scrutiny. Mrs. Brennan, Mitchell said, I understand you've had an eventful morning. I'd like to hear everything you saw from the beginning, and I'd like to hear it in as much detail as possible. Sarah took a deep breath and began the most important performance of her life. She described finding the yacht, boarding it to check for survivors, and discovering evidence of what appeared to be criminal activity. She mentioned seeing men in boats approaching and hiding until they left, but she carefully omitted any reference to taking documents or money from the vessel. Mitchell listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of what he was thinking. When she finished, he asked the question she'd been dreading. Mrs. Brennan, did you remove anything from the vessel? I was scared, Sarah said, which was absolutely true. I just wanted to get away from there before those men arrived. But you didn't take anything. No evidence, no papers, nothing that might help us understand what was happening aboard that vessel. Sarah met his gaze steadily, drawing on every lesson her mother had taught her about dealing with authority figures who assumed poor people were automatically dishonest. Agent Mitchell, I'm a widow with 4 children who depends on the goodwill of this community to survive. The last thing I would do is steal something that would bring federal agents to my door. It was a masterful deflection because it was essentially true, even though it didn't answer his actual question. Mitchell studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether she was being honest or simply careful with her words. Mrs. Brennan, the vessel you found is evidence in a federal investigation that's been ongoing for more than a year. We've been tracking a smuggling network that moves drugs and other contraband through New England ports using luxury vessels as cover. The yacht you discovered may be the break we've been waiting for. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized the scope of what she'd stumbled into. The portfolio hidden in her coat didn't just contain evidence of local criminal activity, it was documentation of a federal case that probably involved multiple agencies and millions of dollars in contraband. What happens now? She asked. Now we process the vessel and see what evidence we can recover. But Mrs. Brennan, I have to warn you that your discovery may have put you and your family at risk. The people involved in this operation don't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. As if to underscore his point, one of Mitchell's agents approached at a run. Sir, we've got a problem. The vessel appears to have been compromised. Someone was aboard before we arrived, and several areas show signs of recent searching. Mitchell's expression darkened as he processed this information. How recent? Very recent. Within the last few hours. And sir, there's something else. We found evidence that documents may have been removed from the vessel's safe. Sarah forced herself to remain perfectly still, even as her heart began hammering against her ribs. The federal agents had discovered that the yacht had been searched, and it would only be a matter of time before they determined what had been taken. Mrs. Brennan, Mitchell said slowly, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you see anyone else near that vessel this morning? Anyone who might have gone aboard before or after your visit? This was the moment of truth. Sarah could confess that she'd taken the documents, hope for federal protection, and probably spend the rest of her life in witness protection. Or she could maintain her deception, hope the federal investigation would eliminate the criminal organizations hunting her family, and try to use the stolen documents as insurance against future threats. There were the men in boats that I told you about, she said. They arrived maybe 20 minutes after I left the area, but I don't know if they actually went aboard. It was the truth as far as it went. She had no idea whether Collins and his team had searched the yacht after her departure, or whether Torino's people had been the ones to discover the missing documents. But it gave the federal agents someone else to focus on while she tried to figure out her next move. Mitchell nodded grimly. Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to arrange for protective custody for you and your family until we can determine the full scope of this investigation. The people involved in this operation have a history of violence against witnesses. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications. Federal protective custody might keep her family safe from Collins and Torino, but it would also make it impossible for her to use the stolen documents as leverage for her own protection. She'd be completely dependent on federal agencies that might or might not be trustworthy, and completely vulnerable if those agencies decided her value as a witness didn't outweigh the cost of protecting her. Agent Mitchell, she said carefully, how long would this protective custody last? Until the investigation is complete and the threats against you have been eliminated. Could be months, could be years. Years in hiding, completely dependent on federal protection, with no control over her family's fate. It was safety, but it was also a different kind of prison. Sarah thought about the portfolio hidden in her coat, about the evidence that could destroy multiple criminal organizations, and about the choice between accepting federal protection and trying to play the dangerous game she'd already started. I need to think about this, she said. I need to discuss it with my children. Mrs. Brennan, this isn't really a choice. Your life is in danger. Your children's lives are in danger. Federal protection is the only way to ensure your family's safety. But even as Mitchell spoke, Sarah was calculating odds and considering alternatives. The documents in her coat were valuable to multiple parties, federal agencies, competing criminal organizations, and potentially other interests she hadn't yet identified. If she played the situation correctly, she might be able to auction that information to the highest bidder while ensuring her family's long-term security. It was a gamble that could get them all killed, but it was also the only path that led to true independence rather than permanent dependence on federal protection that could be withdrawn at any time. "Agent Mitchell," Sarah said, "I want to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I also want to make sure my family ends up somewhere safe and permanent when this is all over. Can you guarantee that?" Mitchell's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Federal protection was temporary, dependent on bureaucratic decisions and budget allocations that could change with political winds. If she wanted permanent security for her children, she'd have to create it herself, and the key to that security was hidden in her coat, waiting to be used by someone clever enough and desperate enough to play the most dangerous game in the world. As the federal agents began organizing their investigation of the Meridian, Sarah Brennan made a decision that would define the rest of her family's life. She was going to gamble everything on her ability to outmaneuver federal agents, criminal organizations, and competing interests that had resources she could barely imagine. The widow who'd climbed down those cliffs that morning looking for hope had found something much more dangerous and much more valuable: the power to change her family's destiny if she was strong enough to wield it. About 6 months later, Sarah Brennan stood in the kitchen of a modest, small but comfortable house in Burlington, Vermont, watching her children eat breakfast, their faces now radiant with happiness instead of the helpless look that had been evident during their last few weeks in Maine. The change was remarkable. James had grown 5 centimeters and, thanks to regular and healthy eating, had become a responsible young adult. Michael and Lily had started at their new school just last week. They were making friends, were very popular with their teachers, and were participating in such wonderful, fun activities for the first time after months of struggling to survive. Even little Emma had stopped hiding the food she had stolen under her pillow. She finally knew she could eat beautifully, healthily, and safely in the days ahead. The house wasn't anything spectacular. It was a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood, where the neighbors and residents were busy with their own affairs but didn't hesitate to say hello when they saw Sarah and her children. But to Sarah, it represented something that 6 months earlier had seemed as impossible as growing wings: genuine independence, bought and paid for with her own cunning rather than dependent on the charity of others or the temporary protection of federal agency. The path to this new life had been neither simple nor safe. After that confrontation on the Maine coast with federal agents, criminal organizations, and competing interests that all wanted control of the information she'd taken from the Meridian, Sarah had made a series of decisions that would have horrified the woman she'd been before Thomas's death. She'd played federal agencies against criminal organizations, used stolen evidence as leverage against multiple parties, and ultimately orchestrated a complex auction for information that had destroyed careers, toppled criminal enterprises, and generated enough money to secure her family's future. The process had begun with her refusal to enter federal witness protection. Despite Agent Mitchell's warnings about the danger she faced, Sarah had insisted on returning to her cottage in Rockport to consider her options. What she'd actually done was implement a strategy that would have impressed intelligence professionals and terrified anyone who understood the risks involved. Using the contact information from the documents she'd stolen, Sarah had reached out to every party with an interest in the Meridian investigation, not just Collins and Tur, but federal prosecutors, newspaper reporters, rival criminal organizations, and even congressional staffers who were investigating corruption in federal law enforcement agencies. She'd offered each of them the same basic proposition: exclusive access to specific portions of the evidence she possessed, in exchange for payments that would ensure her family's permanent security and relocation. The bidding war that followed had been conducted through intermediaries, anonymous communications, and dead drops that kept Sarah's identity hidden while establishing her credibility as someone who possessed genuinely valuable information. Federal agents wanted evidence that would convict high-level criminals. Criminal organizations wanted intelligence about federal investigations and competing operations. Journalists wanted documentation of corruption that could win prizes and destroy political careers. Congressional investigators wanted ammunition for hearings that could reshape federal law enforcement. Sarah had given each of them exactly what they wanted, but never everything they wanted. The portfolio from the Meridian that had been carefully divided into portions that were valuable to specific interests without providing any single party enough information to eliminate a need for her continued cooperation. It was a delicate balance that required her to understand motivations and relationships she'd never encountered before, but desperation had proven to be an excellent teacher. The financial arrangements had been equally complex. Rather than accepting a single large payment that would attract attention, Sarah had negotiated multiple smaller payments that appeared to come from legitimate sources: a consulting fee for providing information to a congressional investigation, a finder's fee for helping journalists locate sources for their stories, a witness stipend from federal agencies, even a settlement from an insurance company that had been defrauded by the criminal organization using the Meridian. Individually, none of the payments were large enough to trigger financial reporting requirements or attract the attention of law enforcement agencies looking for evidence of criminal proceeds. Collectively, they'd provided enough money to relocate her family, purchase their new home outright, and establish trust funds that would ensure her children's education and future security. But money had been only part of the equation. True security required eliminating the threats that had made her family targets in the first place. The documents from the Meridian had contained evidence that destroyed Torino's drug smuggling network, but they'd also revealed federal agents who were taking payments to ignore certain shipping activities. Congressional hearings, based on Sarah's information, had led to the prosecution of corrupt officials and the dismantling of the criminal criminal organizations that had been paying them. The very people who'd wanted to kill Sarah to protect their secrets had been eliminated by the evidence she'd provided to their enemies. Collins and his organization had proven more difficult to neutralize, but Sarah had eventually discovered that they were actually federal agents operating outside normal oversight, a rogue intelligence operation that was using criminal methods to fund activities that Congress had refused to authorize. The evidence of their illegal activities had been particularly valuable to congressional investigators who were looking for ways to reassert legislative control over intelligence agencies that had grown too independent. The beauty of Sarah's strategy had been its symmetry. Each criminal organization had been destroyed by the federal agencies they'd been trying to corrupt, while the corrupt federal agents had been exposed by the congressional investigators they'd been trying to circumvent. Everyone had gotten what they wanted, except for the people who'd wanted Sarah and her family dead. The final phase of the operation had required careful timing and absolute secrecy. Sarah had waited until all the major players were either under indictment, in prison, or dead before relocating her family to Vermont under new identities that would be difficult to trace. The house in Burlington had been purchased through a series of shell companies that obscured the source of the funds, and Sarah's new identity was supported by documentation that would stand up to casual scrutiny, while avoiding the kind of deep background checks that might reveal her past. The children had adapted to their new identities with the resilience that had carried them through their father's death and the months of near starvation that followed. James was now David Carpenter, a high school student whose academic performance had improved dramatically once he was free from the responsibility of helping support his family. Michael had become Mark, 12-year-old who excelled at mathematics and showed a disturbing aptitude for understanding complex strategic relationships. Lily was now Lucy, a bright 9-year-old who channeled her experiences into creative writing that occasionally worried her teachers with its sophisticated understanding of adult themes. And little Emma was now Emily, a 6-year-old who'd finally stopped asking when Papa was coming home. Sarah herself had become Susan Carpenter, a widow whose husband had died in a construction accident, leaving her with a modest insurance settlement that allowed her to purchase their home and focus on raising her children. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, but different enough to prevent anyone from connecting her to the events in Maine. The psychological adjustment had been more challenging than the practical arrangements. 4 months after their relocation, Sarah had woken every morning expecting to find federal agents or criminal enforcers outside her door. She'd installed security systems, established multiple escape routes, and maintained cash reserves that would allow the family to disappear again if necessary. But gradually, as the months passed without incident, she'd begun to accept that her strategy had actually worked. The people who'd wanted her dead were either in prison or dead themselves. The federal investigation of the Meridian had concluded with convictions that satisfied political pressures for accountability. The congressional hearings had generated the kind of reforms that allowed legislators to claim victory over corruption. Everyone who'd been hunting her family had either gotten what they wanted or been eliminated by other parties in the game. But success had come with its own complications. Sarah had been transformed by the events in Maine, had discovered capabilities and ruthlessness that she'd never known she possessed. The woman who'd been willing to blackmail federal agents and auction stolen evidence to the highest bidder was not the same person who'd climbed down those cliffs looking for hope 6 months earlier. She'd become someone who could make decisions that would destroy lives without losing sleep. Someone who could smile at neighbors while maintaining elaborate deceptions about her identity and past. The children had been changed too, in ways that sometimes worried her. James had developed an understanding of power relationships and strategic thinking that was sophisticated beyond his years. Michael showed an instinctive grasp of manipulation and leverage that could be either an asset or a liability as he grew older. Even little Emily displayed a wariness around authority figures that suggested she understood more about their experience than she should at her age, that they were alive and safe and free to build the kind of future that had seemed impossible when they were facing eviction and starvation in Rockport. That was worth any psychological price Sarah had to pay, worth any moral compromises she'd been forced to make. The doorbell rang as Sarah was packing lunches for school, and for just a moment, the old terror returned. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw only the mailman with a package that required signature confirmation. It was a delivery from a law firm in Boston, containing documents related to the final settlement from the insurance company that had been defrauded by the Meridian's criminal owners. Sarah signed for the package and watched the mailman walk back to his truck, disappearing into the normal rhythms of suburban life that had become her family's new reality. She opened the legal envelope and found a check for $50,000, the final payment in a series that had provided the financial foundation for their new life. But attached to the check was a note that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Brennan, I hope you're enjoying your new home. The game isn't over. A friend. Sarah stared at the note, her hands trembling as she recognized the implications. Someone knew who she was, knew where she lived, knew enough about her activities to reference them specifically. The security she'd thought she'd achieved was an illusion, and the people she'd thought she'd neutralized were apparently still in play. She thought about her children, getting ready for school upstairs, building friendships and pursuing dreams that were only possible because of the risks she'd taken and the enemies she'd made. She thought about the documents still hidden in her safety deposit box, evidence that could destroy additional careers and criminal enterprises if she was forced to use it. She thought about the new identities that might not not be as secure as she'd believed, and about the reality that some games never truly ended. But as Sarah Brennan, now Susan Carpenter, stood in her comfortable kitchen holding evidence that her past was catching up with her present, she realized something important about the woman she'd become. 6 months earlier, a threatening note would have sent her into panic, would have had her packing the children for another desperate flight to an uncertain destination. Now, her first instinct was to calculate advantages, identify leverage points, and consider how to turn a new threat into another opportunity for advancement. The widow who'd found an abandoned yacht on a Maine beach had evolved into someone who could play the most dangerous games in the world, and who had the confidence to believe she could win. She walked to the kitchen phone and dialed a number she'd memorized, but hoped never to lose a contact who could provide information about threats and opportunities in the shadowy world she'd never entirely left behind. "This is Susan Carpenter," she said when the call was answered. "I think it's time we discussed some additional business arrangements." As she spoke, Sarah could hear her children laughing upstairs, getting ready for another day of normal life in their safe suburban home. They deserved that normalcy, deserved the security and opportunity she'd fought to provide them. And if protecting that life required her to become someone even more dangerous than the woman who'd blackmailed federal agents and auctioned stolen evidence, then that's exactly what she would do. The game might not be over, but Sarah Brennan had learned something valuable during those months in Maine. She was very, very good at playing games that other people lost, and this time, she wouldn't just be fighting for survival. She'd be fighting for everything her family had built, with all the skills and ruthlessness she'd developed, against enemies who had no idea how dangerous a motivated mother could become. The widow who'd found a yacht had discovered something far more valuable than money or evidence. She'd discovered her own power, and she was prepared to use it to protect everything she loved.